I'm joined now by the host of Pod Save America, Jon Favreau. Jon, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, man.
Okay, so I guess in trying to autopsy a little bit of what happened, given the messaging that really won out in this election, the right-wing media ecosystem was able to really have more of an impact getting their message across than the left. Like I don't know how many Americans out there knew that Kamala Harris supported a $25,000 payment for first-time home buyers, but I'll bet millions of people think that her campaign was predicated on gender reassignment surgeries for trans inmates, right? So how are you thinking about Democrats' responsibility now to invest in and bolster progressive media outlets like yours at Crooked Media, like mine over here, and like others?
So obviously I think it's super important, but I just want to take a step back because I think it's important to know the context of this race, the political and economic context in which it took place. So all over the world, incumbents have been losing vote share. In fact, this is the first time since 1905 that every single governing party in a developed nation lost vote share at the same time, in the same year, same election cycle. And the reason for this, one big reason for this, is the inflation that hit every country after the global pandemic that we went through. And, you know, we can talk about all the statistics that show the economy is doing well and greatest economy in the world and blah, blah, blah. But the truth is, like, people aren't feeling it. A lot of people aren't feeling it. And wages have not kept up with price increases for long enough. Interest rates have just started coming down. And so people's feelings about the economy were not great. And that has been true for a couple of years. And so that's number one. So I think that's like the overall sentiment that is that sort of characterizes the electorate, right? In addition to that, if you look at the counties and the states where Kamala Harris and her campaign actually competed, they lost by much less than places where they did not, the non-battlegrounds. And what that tells me is that, you know, they were going up against an environment that was just, and headwinds that were just too tough to overcome. And so their campaign mattered. The information they got to people mattered. It changed minds. That's why the people in the battlegrounds were more likely to vote for them than people who weren't in the battlegrounds. Obviously, it wasn't enough, but, you know, I do think that they got the message out. Now, obviously, as Democrats, we need to figure out a way to reach more people, not just our people, but reach people who are not just like listening to or exposed to more right-wing propaganda, but people who are not paying much attention to news at all. And, you know, I was reminded of this when we were canvassing, knocking on doors in Phoenix and Vegas the weekend before the election. A lot of the voters we talked to, it's not like they were spouting right-wing talking points or left-wing talking points. Some people were going to vote. They just literally had no idea what Donald Trump stood for or what Kamala Harris stood for. And this was like a couple days before the election, because most people in the country lived their lives without thinking about politics, without thinking about news that much. And I do think we have to figure out a way to get information and get information to these folks and reach them in ways that are not necessarily like purely political content like you and I do.
Well, to that point then, I mean, what the right really does have is an entire media infrastructure that's not even just predicated on politics, right? I think that there's a difference between people who tune into our stuff because it's expressly politics, but I think a big gateway for the right and why they have been successful is because a lot of their stuff is using culture as a gateway to get into politics. And so you have people who aren't politics first. You have the Joe Rogans of the world. You have Elon, although he's been so red-pilled that he's basically politics first now. But you have the Theo Vons and the Shane Gillises and all of these people who folks online listen to, especially Gen Z listens to, especially an overwhelmingly male audience listens to, that do offer a gateway for them to then start to consume, whether it's conscious or not, a lot of these right-wing talking points that win out over what we're trying to push on the left.
Yeah, and I think, well, first of all, like you need you need those personalities on our side, right? Who are have progressive values or liberal values or just left-leaning values, but are out there, popular, have big reach, and don't necessarily just talk about politics. So it's hard to invent those people, but hopefully they'll they'll come forth. But I also think it's time for Democrats and liberals to like go on those shows more, interact with those people, and knowing that if you sit down with a Theo Von or a Joe Rogan or whatever, like that doesn't mean that you agree with everything they say, and it doesn't mean that like if they just had a guest on who is, you don't agree with, or who's just an awful person or whatever, like
that you being there validates their
it doesn't
existence.
matter. It does not validate it. And like, if that's where people are getting their information from, that's where we should be. And we should be making our case there, or at the very least, even if it's not an explicitly political case, just letting people who listen to those shows know that we're not the caricature of liberals that you see on Fox or you hear from Donald Trump.
So, like, with the young male demographic specifically, how are you thinking? I mean, you and your co-host Tommy Dan and Lovett are some of the few people in our party that are not, septuagenarians, are not, longtime cable hosts. Like you guys are young guys, and in a way exactly the demographic that this young male demographic is looking to like form their political opinions or form their opinions about the world. Like how has that informed what you guys? Has that changed your strategy at all in terms of what you're going to be doing moving forward at Crooked? How are you thinking about that in terms of really where there's a giant dearth in influence on the left?
Yeah, well, I wish we were young guys, but we're pretty old now, so I don't even. We're sort of older political nerds. But if what we are passes for being in touch with young men, that just goes to show the extent of the problem that we have. But I will say, like,
when the president is like a septuagenarian heading toward being an octogenarian, I feel like everything pushes forward like 3 decades. So you guys are the young bucks in the party now.
I will say this: when we started Crooked in Pod Save America, one thing that we told ourselves is like, we want to take politics seriously and the issue seriously, but we do not want to take ourselves seriously. And part of the issue with our political system is that too many people in politics don't take the issues seriously enough and do take themselves very seriously.
Yeah.
And you need to be able to laugh at yourself. You need to be able to make fun of other people in good humor, good fun, not without being too mean, right? You need to be able to like take a joke, laugh at a joke, make jokes, have gallows humor when things go wrong. Some of it is just like not being so self-serious, which is I think what you see sometimes on cable and like pundits on cable and sometimes people on Twitter, and like I just, so it really is just being yourself and connecting with people like you would talking with them at a bar, talking with them at a restaurant, how you talk to people in your own life. Like, I just think we have, I mean, and that this is getting into like how, some of the politicians in the Democratic Party, but we're just too on message sometimes, too focused on how.
And it comes across as like inauthentic, because when you put that up against the Joe Rogans of the world, people are going to defer to that over like, political talking points. Yep. 7 days, every day, 7 days out of 7, right?
It's that, and yes, and also it's like, there is a streak in the Democratic Party of like being scolding towards people who disagree with you, who say something wrong,
or who say something wrong, who agree with you and just don't agree with the way you said it.
Right, and we're like quick to label people as opposed to criticizing their behaviors or their comments. We criticize them and say that they're wrong. So like, I just think part of it is just being open to, like, I've been saying this for years now, but like politics, we're in the persuasion game. And what that means is when you encounter someone who doesn't agree with you, the goal is to change their minds. And if you've ever tried to change someone's mind, you don't get there by yelling at them or scolding them or making them feel inferior in some way. And even if mocking them is deserved, even if you know that their position is not just wrong, but you feel like it is immoral, right? The game of politics, the whole point is to get enough people on your side that you have more people than the other side. Yeah. It is addition. It is not subtraction. Like kicking people out of the coalition, kicking people out of the party, that is not going to win us elections. And if we do not win elections, we will not have power. And if we do not get power, we will not be able to help all the people that we profess to care about, that we need to help. And so part of this is showing some empathy to other people who do not agree with us and trying to figure out where they're coming from and trying to change their minds and trying to bring them into the coalition so we can beat the people who are on the extreme, who are now going to be running the country for the next 4 years.
Yeah, I think the expression that comes to mind is you catch more flies with honey.
That
right?
is very true. Yeah.
I think one thing that's tough though, and this does lend itself to the initial question that I opened the interview with, is that even though we do have the more economically populist agenda, and even though we are running against somebody who is not only a billionaire himself, but has ran and not only bankrolled by the literal richest man in the world. So unto itself, already the notion that these people are going to have a populist platform that they're going to abide by is a joke. But Trump's done this before. Like, he ran on a populist platform once. When he actually got into office, all he did with his political capital was pass a tax cut that overwhelmingly favored millionaires and billionaires. I think 83% of the benefits were conferred to the richest Americans, like the top 0.1% of Americans. And so we already know that when you compare the two parties, the Democrats are actually walking the walk when it comes to actually delivering an economically populist agenda. I mean, we have, it was allowed the government to negotiate lower drug prices, cap the cost of healthcare at $2,000, automatic refunds for airline cancellations, eliminate junk fees at banks, $35 insulin. And so you have all these things where they've actually done something versus Trump just giving a tax cut to the richest Americans. So that's on the merits, but that message isn't breaking through. And as far as I think about it, it's just that we don't have a means to compete with the right's messaging distribution system. We don't have a means to compete with, starting at 5 a.m., Fox and Friends, and then Newsmax and OAN and Steve Bannon's podcast and InfoWars and the Nelk Boys and 9 of the top 20 podcasts are all right-wing podcasts. Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, Joe Rogan, Ben Shapiro, right? And they own YouTube and Rumble and Facebook and TikTok. And so we don't have the means to, I guess there's the problem isn't necessarily that we're not doing enough, because we do have the economically populist agenda and we're living it, but it doesn't really matter if nobody knows, because all of that information is being distorted on a daily basis, a 24-hour right-wing propaganda machine that is just spewing whatever they want to say to all the people that are consuming that. And so you can work until you're blue in the face to actually deliver results, but if nobody knows about it, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody's there to hear it, does it really matter?
Yeah. Well, here's the issue. So for a long time, the axis of the debate in America was over the size and role of government. And we talked about tax cuts, and we debated healthcare, and we debated how much the government should spend on helping people versus how many tax cuts we should give to rich people. And that was the case for most of our lives through 2012, through Obama's second term, right? And because that was the central debate in American politics, that was the debate that would get covered. And even though we didn't have the same right-wing media ecosystem then, we got that debate covered because the Republicans wanted to talk about it, we wanted to talk about it, and that's what the media covered. Now, the central debate in American politics is over identity. It is over democracy itself. It is about all the crazy shit Donald Trump does and says and threatens and then doesn't do and then does do. And how many times do we, on Pod Save America, on your show, everywhere, do we have debates about economics and the economy and all the economic accomplishments we're doing, right? I mean, Tommy and I had this, debate on Pod Save America right before the election, which is, Kamala Harris gets asked at a town hall, hey, John Kelly said that Donald Trump's a fascist. Do you agree? And of course, it's like, well, his own chief of staff said he was a
right.
fascist. Well, she didn't go up there that day and be like, I'm going to do a message of the day, fascist. But she said yes. And everyone's like, oh, now they're talking about fascism. And look, I would prefer an economic message. I thought at the time, I'm like, look, the media only covers culture wars, identity wars, Trump is a fascist stuff, democracy at stake stuff. The liberal side, we all talk about that. We don't spend a lot of time talking about the economy. So to have an economic message break through in a way where not only people who pay a lot of attention to politics, but people who barely pay attention to politics understand it, requires more than talking about your list of very good economic policies or your list of very good economic accomplishments. Because, yeah, Democrats have done a lot to help working middle-class people get people out of poverty over the last 4 years even. Joe Biden's done more than a lot of presidents. But if you're someone who hasn't been helped, right, maybe the capping insulin doesn't personally affect you, right?
Yeah.
Maybe you didn't experience the child care tax credit, or you did, and now you're pissed that it expired, and you don't know why it expired.
But you're blaming the guy in charge.
Yeah, and you blame the person in charge. And so for the people who have not been helped, the people who have experienced hardship over the last year because of inflation, I don't know. Well, we have to have an answer for them on why. If we haven't helped them, then we have to have an answer about why we haven't been able to help them. And that answer, which I think is a good one, which is like, we had a bunch of Republicans standing in the way. They voted against it. But like, before we figure out like a mechanism for getting that message to them, that has to be, we just have to live that every day in a way that's like I'm thinking about Trump's next 4 years, and he's going to do a lot of crazy shit. Some of it's going to be really scary. Some of it could be really scary. Some of it could really hurt people that doesn't have to do with economic stuff. But I'm thinking, okay, everyone who voted for Trump, or a lot of people, they thought, well, I don't like him, but I had more money in my pocket when he was president, and so maybe I'll just close my eyes and not pay attention to Donald Trump and just enjoy the Trump economy. Well, now for the next 4 years, we got to be like, hey, how are you feeling about the Trump economy? Do you feel like you have more money in your pocket? Do you know that Democrats wanted to lower your health insurance premiums or lower your prescriptions even further, and Donald Trump is saying no? Do you know the Democrats wanted to give you a tax cut, but Donald Trump wants to give it to the richest people? Over and over and over again. And if we all started saying that on all of our programs, then maybe the media would cover it more.
And so is that I mean, in terms of how what happened on Tuesday is going to inform your coverage moving forward, do you think that there does have to be a stronger through line on economic populism? That issue is so resonant that even with the most dangerous candidate in American history, somebody who a few years ago incited an insurrection against the U.S. government, for them to vote largely based on the economy. I mean, the inflationary impacts across the entire world, like you just said, have led to ousters or losing ground among incumbents across the entire planet, that there's nobody that was spared. So clearly the impacts of inflation are strong, and the effects of the economy are strong. And so knowing how resonant that issue is with voters, like, is that going to inform how you guys do your jobs moving forward? And so like there always has to be and the economy aspect to everything that you do?
I mean, look, I think that's right to an extent. I also think I'm using the economy as an example because inflation was such a big issue in this election. But I think in general, it doesn't just have to be an economic issue that we're talking about. It does have to be an issue that has a tangible effect on people's lives, something that they can feel, right? There is a reason the Democrats did so well in midterms and special elections after Dobbs, because like losing access to reproductive freedom is something that affected people's lives and their families. Yeah. And so that issue could be a resonant issue for people, right? And I do think it's one thing if Donald Trump is dealing with the border and Kamala Harris said she was going to deal with the border too, and Joe Biden did deal with the border in his last, that's one thing. If Donald Trump is going into communities and ripping people away from their families who've lived here for years and are working and are paying taxes and are doing everything right and following the law, and that just because they're immigrants, that he is deporting them and tearing families apart, I think that will matter to people too. And that's something that we should talk about as well, right? But I do think we've got to think about how are people who are out there barely paying attention to politics, how are their lives being affected by what we're saying, what Donald Trump's doing, what we're proposing? And we just have to keep those folks in mind, because those are the people that we're losing, either because they're not paying attention or because they're finding Donald Trump's demagoguery and the demagoguery they hear on right-wing media, they're finding that appealing. And our question is, like, if we're going to win them back, we have to speak to their personal concerns about their lives, whether that's economic, whether that's reproductive freedom, whether that's deportations, whatever it may be. That's what we got to speak to.
And I think that it's incumbent also, I think it's also incumbent upon Democrats to maybe not imbue the mainstream media that is clearly not our messaging distribution system anyway, and B, not going to focus on this stuff. They're going to focus on what they focus on. Like, they're going to focus on these culture issues. Like, if somebody calls Donald Trump a fascist, that's going to lead the story for the day. And so I think it's incumbent on the Democratic politicians to recognize that there are people in the alternative media space who are actually doing the work, who are advocating for Democrats to win elections, as opposed to the New York Times and CNN and ABC, who are not advocating for Democrats to win elections, and in fact engage in a ton of both sidesism and use their voices and their weight to kind of confer more validation onto these outlets that are actually looking out to promote the agenda of the Democratic Party, as opposed to the news outlets which aren't.
And by the way, even if the New York Times, all the headlines were perfect and all of their stories were written exactly how we want them to be written as Democrats and anti-Trump, like the whole anti-Trump coalition, right? And same thing with the Post, same thing with CNN, same thing with NBC. It wouldn't matter that much, because their reach is so much different, and their reach now is college-educated people who pay close attention to the news and politics. And guess what? Democrats have those. We have those voters, and so the alternative media is important, because most people in the country now are getting their news from some other source than the traditional media that we spend so much time worrying about and critiquing. Like, it doesn't matter as much anymore.
Like, for these politicians to lay hands on these mainstream media, these legacy media outlets who reach a fraction, they're chasing after the same 250,000 people in a viewing block, up to 1 million people in a viewing block, who are largely Democratic voters anyway. Yep. And so if the job is, if the goal here is persuasion, which in an election it probably should be, then it really benefits those very politicians to A, reach more people, and B, reach people who are actually persuadable, who actually are figuring out their worldview and not just sitting in front of the news all day, highly informed and going to vote for Democrats anyway. Yeah. Let's finish off with this. And I know that we've spent a lot of this conversation talking about people who aren't necessarily in our coalition, and how to reach out to those people, how we'll kind of restructure and hone our messaging to be able to bring them into the fold. What's your message to the tens of millions of people who are in our coalition, given what happened on Tuesday and the despair and exhaustion that everybody on our side is feeling?
Yeah, well, look, first, it's warranted, and everyone grieves differently, and so if you want to be sad, that's okay. If you want to be angry, that's okay. If you want to just wallow in gallows humor, that's fine too. I've been doing some of that, but and also just like take some time, right? There's some time left with Joe Biden as president still, and we're heading into the holidays, and so like just do yourself a favor, unplug, whatever you need to do to get away from the news. Then when Donald Trump becomes president, like, you have a choice, right? You can check out and you can give up, and for some people that might be the best choice for them. And so I'm not going to make any judgments. But I will say that if you really believe in the kind of country that we have all been fighting for in the last 8 years, 9 years, longer for a lot of people, then I think it is worth staying in the fight, because I was just saying, like, Donald Trump wins in 2016, and the reason that we were able to save the Affordable Care Act is because people organized and marched, and we won a special election in Alabama. So we had an extra senator from there, which, like, who knew that was going to happen? And we saved a piece of legislation that, had it been repealed, millions of people would have lost their health care. And if a bunch of people in 2016 had just said, you know what, I can't do it, then that's the outcome that would have happened. And and a lot of people would have been hurt by that. And so, like, yeah, we didn't win the election against Donald Trump. We didn't stop Donald Trump from coming to power, but that doesn't mean we can't stop bad things from happening and make progress, not just in Washington, but like all across the country, where there's Democrats who are still running blue states and blue legislatures and in governor's offices. And also, like, I was on the Kerry campaign. That was my first campaign out of college. We lost to George W. Bush, partly because his approval rating after 9/11 went, like, skyrocketed and never came back down, even as the Iraq War started becoming unpopular, and John Kerry just couldn't do it. And after that race, everyone was like, well, we're going to need someone from the heartland and maybe, someone who's, like, conservative or whatever else. And if you had told people that 4 years later, a black guy named Barack Hussein Obama from Chicago would become president of the United States in what now counts for a landslide, they would have told you were fucking crazy. Yeah. But that's what happened. And so things in politics can turn on a dime. The environment can turn on a dime. And it doesn't just happen by itself. It happens because people are like, you know what? Things are bad. Things are awful. But I'm just going to keep on fighting. And I'm going to just get up, and I'm going to keep pressing. And I'm not going to stop until we win something. And so I think that's my attitude. And I hope it's everyone else's too.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I would note to people that, we largely feel the same way right now that we did 8 years ago when Trump took to power. And within the very next election, because nobody stepped away, because everybody decided to, like, stay in the fight and stay engaged, stay involved. Not only did we save the ACA, which means that 50 million more Americans have health care right now, but the very next election, the midterm election cycle, saw the biggest margin for Democrats in the House in modern American history. And so it's unfortunate, to say the least, that we are in this cyclical nightmare where it takes the election of Donald Trump, first in 2016, now in 2024, to get people paying attention. But in the same way that people in 2016, that brought a lot of people, that brought an entire class of Americans into the political process, sure, myself included. Yep. I wouldn't, you guys wouldn't have Crooked in the way that it is today without that. My channel wouldn't exist. I would still be, trying to audition for Cars.com commercials and like, again, it is the. To call it unfortunate is the understatement of the century, but there are silver linings to keeping, for when bad things happen, in the way that it gets people engaged in the political process and activates people to fight for what's right. And a lot of people back in right now don't remember what it was like when Trump was in office, maybe have been fed revisionist history by right-wing media about what it was like, and they think that it was this time of great prosperity and that we weren't burying Americans in mass graves and that nurses weren't showing up to work in garbage bags. Maybe they were too young to even remember what it was like when Trump came into office, because these kids are 18, 19, 20 years old, and they were 12 when he first became president. So whatever it was doesn't mean that those people too won't come to realize the chaos that follows this guy when he comes into office. And I think that's absolutely going to happen, because if we know anything about Trump, it's that we can't escape that. He can't escape that. He cannot avoid the drama that follows him wherever he goes. And I think people are going to tire of it quickly, and hopefully we'll see the same kind of activation that we saw in the midterms in 2018 that ultimately led to his ouster and ultimately ushered in, a really important era of democratic progress that we're at the end of right now. So, with that said, all of this underscores how important, you guys over at Crooked are going to be in the next few years as we continue to fight against what is going to be a really difficult period that we're about to engage in. But I would highly recommend for anybody watching, if you are not yet subscribed to Pod Save America here on YouTube, I'll put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. And of course, make sure to support Pod Save America as an audio podcast. And you guys are like you guys are it in a sea of red, because I actually looked at the top 20 chart and it is grim.
It's
and
grim.
you are
It's grim.
you are holding it down amid some pretty bad company there. So again, for everybody watching, please support Pod Save America. Jon, thanks so much for taking the time, man.
Thanks for having me, Brian. Take care.